So, after such a mammoth session already, it's probably good to recap where we're at. Where have we been in terms of development of the film industry? We've moved from the invention of moving pictures through to the first sort of displays, through to innovations with terms to projection, into the movement from factual information and short scenes into narrative, into the first sort of custom-built cinemas, the Nickelodeons, and their popularity. We can, pull all those things together and look at how those developments, result in how we best understand cinema as it comes after the demise of the Nickelodeon. Before getting to that point, we need to look at, what kind of industry was being built. So the early industry was dominated by some major companies: Edison, Vitagraph, Selb, Lubin, Kalem, etc., etc. Edison had always tried to restrict competition through patents, but this was actually quite difficult to do back in those days. Edison wanted to keep a grip on cinema, but kind of failed to do that, really. All these major companies, though, were all obviously in competition with one another, and they saw this as a major disadvantage at the time. It meant there was a lack of interoperability with other devices, other methods of doing things. It kind of limited the industry. So in 1909, the major companies joined with the largest distributor and Eastman's Kodak Film Company to form the Motion Picture Patents Company on the 1st of January 1909 to pool and control all the patents and licenses in the American film industry. The result of this was to standardize equipment, to standardize production practices, but also control the industry itself through their monopoly, to stop anyone else coming in and to make the film industry into a closed shop. And that meant that those companies were involved in, who were there, now had a solid monopoly position to go and consolidate and dominate the market. Now, these film companies start to, although they've solidified their position, they do start to compete with one another. So you get a time of increasing competition, and films themselves become brand names, and people actually went to see company films. People would go and see films by this company or this company because they knew what they were getting off those companies. There was really standard fare. Like, for example, here, Biograph films, for example, they knew they were getting a very human-focused cinematic experience from going to watch a Biograph film's picture. And this kind of led to, or certainly was a factor in, a change in film style in the first decade of the 20th century. Early styles were rooted in theatre and melodrama, but there was a move to more naturalistic acting rather than film acting, a move to a more sort of naturalistic style and biographical style. And you get from full-length shots to varied shots. You stop having these long shots and things. You start to see different editing techniques come in, and use of close-ups with cameras allowed identification of the actual actors and actresses, and starts to lay the foundation, therefore, for the identification of not just actors but stars. And the star system starts to develop at this time. So companies at first didn't credit actors at all. Actors were just people doing their job. But the public started to form their own identifications of these people as they saw them frequently in films made by the same company over a long period of time. I guess the first star of all was Florence Lawrence, who's pictured there behind the text. And she becomes the subject of the first film PR stunt in 1910. We nail a lie. What happened was, as she moved from Biograph films to IMP films, there was a rumour put around that she died. And it was like, whoa, Florence Lawrence is dead, Florence Lawrence is dead. And then to promote her first film with IMP, it was like, no, she's alive, and she's in this film, which is coming out from IMP. She's now with IMP, and, check her out. You not only is she alive, but you can watch her in this film. Such a poor quality trick. So worked though. Suckers! But it completely worked. People bought this hook, line and sinker. And it was a really, really useful ploy to use with the suckers who would go and watch movies. So this is the start of actors being stars, and it became a huge part of the Hollywood system. You can't underestimate the importance of this. And in terms of our thinking about it as a medium, it's not just a medium for broadcasting, but it's also a medium for all sorts of subsidiary economics as well, like stars being out there, and the things that would be produced about stars, like fan magazines, photos, postcards, posters, calendars. Stars in themselves became an industry on themselves as audience favourites like Florence Turner and Mary Pickford started to emerge. A whole secondary industry around cinema started to emerge: merchandise. And the use of merchandising was a very, very early form. People often bemoan sort of, oh God, Star Wars killed cinema because it brought merchandise and now it's all just a way of selling toys. They were doing this like before people were even speaking in movies. They were doing this before the First World War, so it's always been around and always been a feature of cinema. If you want to know the others, sort of Florence Lawrence, we've already seen. There's Mary Pickford there. These became the most bankable assets within the cinema industry. People wanted to go and see their films and identify with the cinema that was being produced with them as a core in it. So stars toured theatres, they gave interviews to the press, and their salaries rose exponentially. Mary Pickford went from $175 a year in 1910 to over $1 million a year in 1916. And that's some major mazzola. And this was the Bollywood birth of the Hollywood star system. And indeed, to match the emergence of the star system, you start to see different films as well. Films by 1910 were mostly one-reel comedies, chases, or melodramas. Now, they didn't cost much to produce and to send out, and they were easily swapped over. So there was continually changing shows, but they were all much of a muchness to one another. Now, in the 1910s, longer, more complex films started to emerge, and these had to be displayed in custom-built and custom-hired theatres that had the facilities for people to sit in for a long time, to be comfortable in that environment. Your Nickelodeon was no good for this. Now, these longer-form films proved to be very, very popular and attracted larger, more affluent audiences who were willing to pay more, up to a quarter, to see a longer film. Now, the first feature film, therefore, was Australian, The Story of the Kelly Gang in 1906, which went for 60 minutes. Which is a huge increase in the early cinema being produced by America, which was mostly 10 to 30 minutes. So films of this length started to emerge in 1906, but really America cottons onto it in the 1910s. You start to see major box office successes of these longer films. So Queen Elizabeth from France in 1912, Quo Vadis from Italy, and Cabiria in 1914. Long, expensive, large sets and large scales of production, and therefore an emphasis on huge production values. And by production values here, I mean not just what's on the screen, but what goes on off the screen as well. Lots of extras, lots of crew, investing a lot of money, but seeing immediate returns on that investment with the number of people who would actually attend these films. Quo Vadis, the first blockbuster, 5,000 extras. Huge lavish sets, spectacular production, and the spectacle itself drove audiences to consume these films. Audiences wanted to see big, huge scale productions that they'd never seen before. And so very quickly the American industry started to cotton on to this. Now, the key innovator in America was D.W. Griffith. He really was the leading filmmaker of the early period, made 450 short films from 1908 to 1913, so very prolific in short film making. But then he moved into feature-length historical epics, and there's two most famous films, probably A Birth of a Nation in 1915 and Intolerance in 1916. Now, he's credited Griffith with inventing and refining many key techniques in filmmaking. Camera movement, for example. Cameras had largely been static before that, so Griffith was the first to use tracks, for example, and various camera movement techniques in order to create a completely different style of shot. Panoramic long shots, cross-cuts, close-ups of actors, spatial and temporal manipulation for all you Tarantino fans out there. Griffith was doing a long time before. Night scenes, which had never really been done before. Griffith was instrumental in that. And a 3-hour-long musical score. Remember, we're still in the age of silent movies here, so 3-hour-long scores to go along with movies, which became just as popular in many ways as the movie themselves. Unfortunately, D.W. Griffith was also a massive racist. So if you've ever seen, yeah, I'm not going to show Birth of the Nation in these lectures or anything like that. I'm not going to put it up on Canvas. But you can go on YouTube and see Birth of the Nation. Birth of the Nation is a horrendous film. It was a Civil War and Reconstruction era people with one of the most racist portrayals of black people ever committed to cinema still. It basically heroically portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as sort of great American patriots. It was really popular. Earned more than $10 million on its release, which speaks a lot about American society at that time. But it's one of the worst, sort of most racist films ever made. So yeah, D.W. Griffith, great pioneer, huge racist. At the same time as America was embracing narrative cinema, you start to see film as an international industry. And film as an international industry was unique in that it was not restricted by a language barrier, because we still hadn't got to the point where speech was used in films. So films were silent at this point in time. So United Kingdom, France, Italy, and most of Scandinavia had very important industries. Edison's patent controls till 1909 meant that 2/3 of films in the US were European films, actually, which meant, because of that, American audience very quickly got into a sort of appreciation of European filmmaking as well. And so European films, and if you like, what I'm trying to get at here is that film in the United States was heavily influenced by European films, but also this international trade in films meant that film from a very early stage was an international business. It wasn't just focused purely on America. There were other film industries available, and films traveled between places very frequently. And the converse, of course, will happen. So even though at the beginning European films were used heavily in the American cinema industry, as time goes on, the American cinema industry would export to Europe very, very heavily, and it would become a major export industry for American, for American society in general, with all sorts of consequences for that. Hollywood cinema in itself has often been called, a great exponent of American soft power. And that's absolutely true. The ideological messages encoded in American films would be exported to other countries and would have profound social and political effects on those countries as Hollywood began to dominate cinema going forward from this stage. So there was a dominance of Europe at the beginning, and that really was kind of a consequence of the trust the MPPA, people not moving into features very early, and US films were seen as inferior. This prompted a significant move in the US industry, though. US films improved with the move west to Los Angeles and the founding of Hollywood. And you may ask, well, why Hollywood? Like, why did they move to Hollywood? And the simple answer to that is light. Cinema at that time required light. You needed natural light to produce films, and where better than California, and so Hollywood was picked really on the basis of the quality of its natural light. It might seem like an accident, but it's actually it's the one element that you need in order to make good quality cinema is good quality natural light, and Hollywood had it in droves. So in October 1911, the Nestor Motion Picture Company was the first studio to open in Hollywood. From 1912, many companies moved there. The climate, obviously the climate's also important. Very little rain there, and light was very good for cinema. There were cheaper production facilities. There was a range of natural scenery around, a couple of miles away from the ocean, a few miles away from the mountains, so you had a lot of natural scenery around there. So there was a lot of advantages to move into Hollywood, and moving an entire industry into a small area like Hollywood was very, very, very beneficial. So the US industry very quickly improved with longer, better quality films. And the outbreak of World War I really put the end of European film distribution for 4 years, production and distribution. Now, the Americans were firstly very neutral in their depiction of war, but gradually started to produce pro-Allied films. Seeing a business opportunity as the European market had shut down because everyone was at war, American studios started to produce pro-British, pro-French films at that point in time in order to sell to those markets. The Americans entered the war in 1916, and this led to propaganda films, just as we saw with the Spanish-American War of 1898. Propaganda films became very successful, and war really aided film. Patriotism was profitable and enabled the films and the film industry to defend itself against critics, these sort of moral critics that really showed their teeth around Nickelodeons. After World War One, cinema would really continue that political role and start to become a major weapon in the American fight against communism, and it started to begin to attack communism through this medium. So there was a division during this time as well between Nickelodeons and theatres. As films became longer, they became more complex, and they demanded a more comfortable environment. The Nickelodeon and the theatres didn't really cut it much anymore. This was bridged with the birth. So this difference between the comfort of the theatre and the terribleness of the Nickelodeon was bridged with the birth of new large-scale, what they called movie palaces, custom built for cinema but mid-priced. So they had a modicum of luxury, but they were not so expensive as to price audiences out. And here you start to see the last development really of early cinema, the development of custom built screening houses. And so the cinema industry becomes complete. They've developed the technology, they've started to develop production and completed the production process. They developed the distribution processes. They developed subsidiary industries like the star industry. They've improved the form of cinema itself in terms of narrative, in terms of cinematic innovations, and now it closes the circle, if you like, with the development of custom-built spaces to display films in. So first major one, New York City, the Strand Theatre, cost $1 million to make, but made it back in plenty easy time. And you start to see great, grand places for showing cinema, like the Palace Theatre here in Cleveland. Look at the chandeliers, look at the staircase, incredible stuff. My favorite of all, Paramount Theatre in Oakland. Wow, just staggering. This is a cinema. Go in there and you think, I'd be looking at the walls rather than the film. But these sort of spaces started to emerge and consolidated cinema's role as the preeminent medium for mass broadcast of its time. These people's palaces, they democratized luxury, open to all for the price of a ticket, and a magical dream world, housing the stars, cut off from the dreary everyday world, especially in a post-World War I depression. And escapism developed through these, which became vitally important and became still critical to how cinema operates today as a public entertainment. Cinema by the 1920s had matured. It was a huge international entertainment industry, mass-producing dreams for mass audiences, and a central element of modern leisure. And we'll get into some of the meaning of this in the seminars and what this means in terms of McLuhanism and where it sits today as well. But thank you for listening.